Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is James Hansen. I am the Vice President and Publisher of NextGov, the Federal Technology News Division of Government Executive Media Group. It is my pleasure to welcome you to today's program, Protecting Your Data Ecosystem with Zero Trust, sponsored by Thundercat and NetApp. With the ability to generate insights, accelerate decision-making, inform policy, data is one of government's most valuable assets. However, in a world of disparate and decentralized data sources and formats, securing data is a complex challenge that requires looking beyond network perimeters to take an enterprise focus on users, assets, and resources. During this digital webcast, government and industry leaders will explore how to leverage zero trust to protect critical government data. From applying the framework to ransomware threats or supply chain attacks, such as the SolarWinds breach, to ensuring your implementation complies with guidance from DoD, NIST, NSA, and other agencies. These experts will detail the latest trends and best practices for adopting zero trust. And we are fortunate to have with us Sean Connolly, TIC Program Manager at the Department of Homeland Security's Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, Kurt Steege, the Chief Technology Officer of Thundercat Technology, and Heidi Shea, Principal Analyst serving security and risk professionals at Forrester. Throughout our program, we will be taking questions from you, the audience, so make sure to submit them. Any questions that you have, comments via the Q&A tab on the right side of your screen. You don't have to raise your hand, just type it in and we'll get to it throughout the program. But before we dive in, I'd love each of our participants to provide a little more brief or detailed intro of yourself, give a little background on your organization's mission and your role to support that. So Sean, I'm gonna start with you, my friend.
Hey, James. Thank you very much, and thank you to GovExec for the opportunity to speak today. So my name is Sean Connolly. I lead the TIC program office at CISA, TIC Trusted Internet Connections. Last summer, we released a wealth of guidance to the agencies. OMB had released an update to the TIC initiative. TIC initiative was really about protecting the agency's perimeters. And as James was talking about in the beginning, about securing that boundary. The last 10 years, TIC was focused more on that castle and moat philosophy, protecting the agency's north-south traffic, if you will. But with the update to TIC initiative and then the guidance released last year, it's really moving the architecture forward, being able to support alternative architectures. And we weren't even out of the gate in releasing the guidance, and everyone's already asking us about, hey, when's there a zero trust architecture coming out? So this is very timely. I look forward to speaking with you and Heidi and Kurt.
Awesome. Thanks, Sean. Heidi, you want to go next?
Sure thing. Well, thanks for having me. Hi, everyone. I'm Heidi Shea, a principal analyst at Forrester. So I primarily cover data security, privacy within my research. And Forrester is a tech and marketing research firm. So we advise organizations when it comes to their strategies, their best practices around various domains, including cybersecurity. So back in, I think it was 2009 at this point, a fellow analyst, John Kindervag, was the one who went and coined the term zero trust and started putting together the early iteration of just what does this type of strategy look like, what could it be, and we've continued to build on and evolve the concept since then within our research.
Awesome. Thank you, Heidi. And we're definitely interested and we'll dive into some of the differences and things that you guys are seeing on the commercial side and enterprise side of zero trust. Kurt, you want to round us out?
Sure. Yeah, as you said before, Kurt Steege. I'm the CTO at Thundercat Technology. We're a service-disabled, veteran-owned small business VAR within the federal space. Started about 12 years ago, servicing mostly the data center around, the typical storage, compute, and networking. But as that has increased and as that has grown, we've moved into many different areas around how that infrastructure is then managed, and began cybersecurity practices. My own work has been done a lot recently in the DevSecOps and AI and ML space as well. So we're kind of pushing that value part of the value added reseller, in terms of building relationships with our different groups, both in the public and private sector.
Awesome. Thank you, Kurt. Let's stick with that order for my first question. So zero trust is an operating philosophy and principle, and it can mean a lot of different things at different agencies. It's certainly the buzzword or trend in the security space right now in the federal government. But I'd like to hear from each of you about what zero trust looks like from your perspective in terms of the federal government. And then Heidi, as I mentioned, certainly anything that you've seen on the private sector side. But Sean, why don't we start with you and hear your thoughts around what zero trust looks like in federal government?
Sure. Thanks, James. So I think when we talk about zero trust, we recognize it's more of a set of principles and not a single architecture or solution. You mentioned the operating philosophy. I think that's the right way to frame this. We've worked heavily with NIST. NIST has been leading a lot of the efforts in the federal government to lead those discussions. And they look at this as an evolutionary step in cybersecurity. There's a number of principles that NIST has put into a zero trust special pub. I think there's about 6 or 7 tenets they have in there. And these are tenets really, what Heidi was talking about earlier, going back to what John Kundervag was doing over at Forrester. These principles are pretty well accepted. We recognize all data and services need to be considered resources, that you need to secure those resources, that access is determined by per session data. The enterprise wants to collect information on these sessions and stuff. So just, like I said, I think 7 tenets of that, and they all couple together, but they're supporting this philosophy of starting with no trust of a zone or a user or an entity, and then building trust around that, having algorithms, and like Kurt was talking about, using some ML and BI magic and stuff to make that happen. So in the federal space, we're working with a number of agencies as they start to begin their journey towards zero trust. As we talk to them, they're more in a pilot or proof of concept phase where they have a certain number of users, a small number of users, and they're building up different alternative protections for them, maybe on the devices they're using to connect from. Obviously, the telework surge, we're more connecting from home, and so protections may be more toward that remote user, that remote desktop. And then also, a lot of times that user's going to the cloud, and you can be able to use different solutions. They're in the cloud provider, using something like a CASB in the middle to provide those protections. So we're starting to see agencies move toward that first step, as we talked about building some pods with limited number of users, with an expectation to grow that out as their pilot develops. Back to you, James.
Thanks, Sean. And I want to get back to, we'll come back to, I'd like to hear who some of those agencies are that have started pilots and kind of where they are at in that journey. But Heidi, I'd like to hear from you next in terms of, what does zero trust look like for both federal government and private industry? And I'd also be curious, like, how is from where it was, that term was first coined, like, how has that evolved since then to where we are today, that there are pilots that are underway in government?
Yeah, I mean, it's been a journey. And I think we've also seen how different it can be within commercial and within the enterprise, as well as within government. When this first came out, a lot of it was about, we talk about it in terms of an approach, principles, strategy, sometimes like framework, philosophy. Those are terms that get tossed around as well. But the idea was that zero trust could be something that could help an organization to have this singular view, I guess, of how they would approach security, as opposed to in the past, when oftentimes when we were talking to enterprises, they were so focused on compliance. Right? They could say like, well, we did this whole checklist of things, therefore we're secure. And we know that's not true. That doesn't happen. Compliance is not the equivalent to security. So zero trust aimed to help to change that perspective. And how that's evolved is that I think early on, so much of it was focused on the network security component, on not having perimeter-centric security, trying to make it a lot more data-centric. And over time, it's evolved to be this concept where, yes, you're looking at multiple pillars, I guess, of security and how you approach it. Networks is one, data is another, how you secure your workloads, your people, and how you think about things like securing your devices, or how you wrap visibility and analytics around everything you're able to see and do and try to automate as much as you can as well. So it's really grown, I think, as a strategy, as a concept over time.
Well, especially as the perimeter continues to dissolve, where there isn't, a pure perimeter, or it's so far out that you don't know where to start in terms of securing that perimeter. Apologies about that. Kurt, what are some of the things that, that you see in terms of, what Zero Trust means to the agencies that Thundercat has been supporting?
Sure. Thanks, James. I think it's kind of interesting. A couple of different aspects of it. Number one is I've been working in the field for quite some time, and you'd hear the old saying of trust but verify things. And what's really ironic about that is that it came from a Russian proverb that was used extensively by Ronald Reagan when he was negotiating nuclear treaties. So, and it was like, hey, this is a Russian proverb. And then we'd have guys like Gorbachev coming in and talking about, using Emerson in order to have conversations with Reagan and back and forth. But I think what that's kind of, Zero Trust came around and started talking about, no, don't trust everybody, always verify everything. And I think, verification of security is really paramount before trusting another entity. The idea has been around for a while, as Heidi was saying, and you said as well. It came out of the Forrester group, 10 years ago. But it's what's interesting is that, just in the last couple of years, it's really come back to the forefront. And the work that Sean's done on his side, making his architecture applicable into the government space is really key here. And then a little bit to reiterate what Heidi was saying as well, is like much of this effort I feel has always been focused on the network portion of this. It's like, oh, okay, yeah, we've got this perimeter, we got to make sure that this is there. We talked about the moat castle kind of thing. But in the past, that boundary of the network is, up until very recently, and not just because of the pandemic, but that boundary was still the data center for quite some time. And it was like, okay, fine, we can deal with that here. We can start to work these things out. But not only the global pandemic, but the push towards more cloud-based initiatives, that edge has now gone further out. And it's placed a less, I don't say a lower importance on the network side of it, but it's placed an even greater importance on the data-centric Zero Trust concepts in conjunction with those network-based policies, to make sure that the data itself is the thing that you're making sure you're concerned about, but the access to that data is through the global network.
And so to follow up on that, what type of infrastructure does an agency need in order to either start or be on this journey to Zero Trust?
I think there's a little bit there. So there's, in a way, there's no required data or network to start down the path. Like all data, all networks are going to have something there. You really just kind of need to understand what you have and then work towards creating the ability to implement policy on what you have. We talked earlier, I know Sean had mentioned a whole bunch about understanding, mapping what your network traffic is in order to understand what's going north, south, east, west, data flow across your network. Understand that, in a modern enterprise, data is going to go not only within your data center, but it's going to be outside your data center. In this COVID world, it's been pushed to, the edge more often to laptops, like I'm sitting on right now in my house, in different architectures pose different challenges, all the different network technologies. You need to do that to build a picture of your network. What's your firewall? What does your data look like? Packet capture, AI operations and things like that. But that visibility doesn't just stop at like what the network is. You need to talk through your log sources. You need to look at where you're storing information and stuff like that. And then understanding users and groups and understanding the location of all your organizational data. I think that's something we'll get into a bit more as we go further down. I think the next question really hits that in terms of information, where it is. but understanding data, understanding that classification and where things are, and understanding the best way to give access to that information. And I'll turn it back over to you and to the other panelists, so I don't keep talking for the rest of the hour. But
no. And I do want to dive into that data question, right? Like, how do you identify, classify data? I think, Sean, I'm curious to hear, how CDM might have had an impact on TIC 3.0. But just staying on the infrastructure question, I mean, Heidi or Sean, is there any thoughts or best practices based on your conversations with agencies and type of infrastructure that they have and need to get to? Sean, I know you talked about migration to cloud. Are there any requirements there that really needs to put you on that path to zero trust?
Go ahead, Heidi. I'll back clean up. Go ahead.
Oh, sure. The infrastructure one is an interesting one. It's because the way that I tend to address this for folks is that you likely already have a good amount of this already in place. I mean, unless you're starting completely from scratch with your security program and your security architecture, you've put things in place already. So kind of take stock of what's already there and look at the zero trust, I guess, readiness and maturity of what is already in place. So oftentimes, for example, if we're looking at an enterprise and they're trying to get some quick wins for a zero trust approach in a program, something that's tangible, that's visible, with an impact on the organization, they oftentimes start with what they can do around identity and devices. Excuse me. So things like single sign-on, having multi-factor authentication, doing a more thorough review of access privileges so they can apply least privilege, trying to consider things like passwordless authentication. If they're segmenting networks already, great. They can also take a closer look to see, are they doing this for IoT devices? Are they doing this to support bring your own device and conducting health checks on those endpoints before allowing them to connect to the network or to access systems? So I think these are sort of the hygiene things that many organizations may already be doing. So they already have a good chunk of that infrastructure in place.
Yeah, I think first, kudos to Kurt for the Reagan nod there. Everyone thinks it's Reagan coined it, but you're right. He hijacked, if you will, for the Russian proverb for his own use. So yeah, going back to what Heidi was talking about, from NIST, we have those logical components that are outlined, and these are abstract and potentially abstract, so they can apply to different ways. But we have the policy decision point, which is coupled with the policy administrator, the policy engine itself, and then we have the policy enforcement point. And so these are useful to the agency to apply in different ways, whatever benefits them. From the TIC side, we have what we call trust zones, and that's the entity what you're trying to secure, right? And I mentioned before, and the old TIC 2 model was essentially everything below the TIC. It was the agency data centers, headquarters, branch office. Well, as we're distributing out the security now and distributing out the architectures, now you can do a much more granular application of the security, protecting the users, protecting the data. From our side, what we find is interesting, and this goes back to a little bit what Kurt was talking about, was with the NOCs and SOCs, it's that new type of telemetry that the agencies are receiving and understanding what do we do with this, because the context can really change. Heidi hit on the head with identity before, and identity, we've talked before about how identity is the new perimeter. I almost look at identity as the fabric, the new network, right? That's keeping everything together. So as agencies starting to receive this new type of telemetry, especially identity telemetry, having the proper context, understand, okay, this is legitimate and this is not legitimate, greatly changes from where we were at TIC 2 and just having signature based and more applying, signatures to IP addresses. And we know IP addresses are much more ephemeral now. Understanding this user shouldn't be a super user, or this is the normal activity for a different user. And all that's, I think, part of the effort where we need to change how we absorb all this telemetry coming into us. We understand this zero trust architecture.
And so, thinking of data, and, it's traditionally increasingly stored outside of the, network perimeter. But agencies are certainly moving much faster to the cloud, or really a hybrid cloud model, in terms of, mapping that data architecture, data fabric. Sean, I'll start with you because I do think of CDM as kind of a baseline for agencies in terms of, mapping their network and doing that data and user mapping. But how does data fit into the zero trust architecture overall, especially with agencies moving to the cloud?
Sure, great. Yeah, going back to CDM, and to be fair, I was also part of the CDM program for the first few years. Phase one of CDM was about inventory, exactly what you're talking about, James, right? Inventory of users, inventory of the physical assets, inventory of the software assets and such. And really having that understanding, and we've talked about shadow IT before in the past, and understanding what's out there. Now with the way, some users can spin up cloud instances much faster. It's a challenge of how do we still create and maintain that inventory in a way when the solutions themselves, or the data itself, is much more ephemeral. So this is something the CDM program has been tracking very, very tightly. We've been working with a number of agencies on how they're using some of the CDM tools to monitor or assess their environments. Same time from the Einstein team here at CISA, NCPS team, before we had our sensors, our situational awareness at those physical ticks, those castle and moat philosophy, at the moat. But we are looking at ourselves, again, same thing. How do we build awareness around this new model going forward? So leaning back on NIST special pub, they have a number of architectures in their special pub. I think enterprises, satellite facilities, multi-cloud, cloud to cloud, and all these, to your point, James, have got to be understood to a very high degree to be able to build out a secure architecture for these. So this is a complicated and long-term problem that we're going to have. I think to our credit, through CDM, through NCPS, through a lot of the efforts GSA has been doing with FedRAMP and EIS, we have a strong understanding of just being able to apply them to this new environment we have.
Kurt, can you jump in? I mean, you were just kind of talking about it. How does data factor in building this, whether it's from an authentication perspective or leveraging data as a strategic asset to support this? How do you guys look at that, and when you're talking with government agencies and customers?
Sure, and I think you're right. And if you look back at the Forrester model and the discussion, data really is the central core of everything. I have stated in the past that I think data is really the today's real currency. The information that's there, it's what everybody produces, what the government produces in order to educate citizens. It's what the government uses in order to protect citizens, and all these things. And it is the core. So regardless of everything else that's going on from a network, from the network lifeblood there that moves the things around, you've got the network, you've got the workloads that refer to the data, the people. People use that information. The network is just a way to get it to them, in many cases, and the devices are how they receive it. So that core and that center is really important, because we keep going back to the network side. What good is a solid protected network that has no data on it? What are you going to do with it, right? A key part of the initial Forrester discussion on zero trust architecture focused on what's called the microcore and perimeter, which is where the data and all its associated usage resides within that microcore. And as Sean and as Heidi has said before, you need to know what you have. Data visibility is the first step. It's where many folks go wrong. They think they know where their data is, but then they implement something and have this discussion of saying, oh, I didn't know my data was over here. I didn't know it was over here. I didn't know that this particular thing was in a spot that's there. Ask your agency leaders what data is important. Dig further. Ask about classification, storage, protection. If folks don't have the answers, and you got to figure it out, then you really need to understand why you need a true data management strategy in order to go at this thing. One thing that has been good in this in this field, as well as like our partner who we're talking on this NetApp includes within their ONTAP software something called an F policy zero trust engine that kind of illuminates all those points that are necessary around following a zero trust architecture. And I think that's key there to say, you know, how can I define that policy? Who has access to that information? How is that going to a different spot? And how do I make sure that's secured? Hopefully that, you know, adds a little bit of color there.
No, absolutely. I mean, Heidi, I don't. My next kind of question was to you, so you can you know add your color or any additional thoughts around really the managing the data piece within a zero trust model. But you guys recently estimated that about 80% of data breaches are caused by misuse of privileged credentials. You talked about it just a few minutes ago. And we're learning now that that might have been one of the vulnerabilities in the recent hack. How can Zero Trust help combat that issue? And how do you approach it?
Yeah, I think this also dovetail with the what Kurt was talking about with data as well, because I think he's spot on. A lot of folks don't know what it is that they're trying to protect, but I think under Zero Trust there's another element to data. You also have to think about your I guess security data, the context around what you're able to observe, the visibility you have, the situational awareness about where someone may be coming in from, if they're trying to log in, what device they're on, what time is it, like all this other nitty-gritty info that you can use to help make that policy decision to say, okay, we'll allow you access, or to say, no, this looks a little bit fishy, let's look into it a bit more. Because yes, misuse credentials it's a huge issue. And I think at the root of Zero Trust, this is about, you know, you always verify, you never trust, because you're just assuming that compromise is that state that you're dealing with. I mean, just because someone has the right credentials doesn't mean they're actually that person who's trying to log in. So that's why you need this other context, this other security data that's associated with the login to help make those policy decisions to grant that access. And it's not like a one-time thing. You check them all out and they're in. It's also, okay, someone's logged in and now maybe they're trying to do things, they're poking around. Maybe it's legitimate, they're getting their jobs done, but maybe now they're looking into places where they shouldn't be, and that should raise some red flags internally.
Yeah. How do you, how do you determine whether you leverage a single sign-on or a multi-factor authentication when somebody is getting on? What determinations or I guess, you know, those alerts that tell you we should use this or that?
I think that's something you could set based on policy and based on risk as well, in terms of how you classify that type of action that's happening. Because if everything looks normal in the sense of, you know, this is an action you've seen before from this particular user, it's typical for them, then it's, yeah, single sign-on, why not? You're in. But if there's anything within that series of checks that you're doing where it starts to look just a little bit off, that's where you may want to initiate some additional factor or even some other thing to confirm that this is legitimate.
Kurt, you mentioned, just I will follow on to that. You mentioned earlier, you were talking about, you know, your background and some of the work that you guys are doing. I mean, it is, what type of technologies are required to kind of support that effort? Do agencies need to have robust analytics and AI capability within a zero trust architecture to determine all of those little, you know, alerts or things in terms of people's activity?
Well, if you're asking me, they need a lot of AI and machine learning, you know, regardless of what they're doing, whether we're talking about zero trust or whether we're talking about, helping people as well, you know, and completing their mission, regardless of what's going on. I do want to bring thing just back 1 second and then come forward is what's interesting about the SolarWinds hack that you mentioned, you know, at the beginning of the question is really, you know, it encompasses a couple of areas that I think have been front and center for the federal space, kind of in the last couple of years. And those are both the way that the SolarWinds hack was built into what they're calling the supply chain, and zero trust architecture. So knowing the components of your software throughout its life cycle is really important here, because what happened is that, they hacked a third party. That third party that was then implemented within the space of what we're talking about here. So it kind of goes to a couple of different areas that I've been working in. So the importance of DevSecOps and the methodology, and kind of in the last couple of months, a lot of my kind of discussions have been around, hey, how do I understand what a software bill of materials is? Everybody kind of understands, okay, I'm buying this router, this switch, or computer. I know I've got this chip in here, this this networking card here, and that's all well and good. But folks don't understand in a lot of cases that they're using open source technology within these bits of software that's there. So kind of they need to understand, build policies that are laid out within the software development lifecycle. That goes for the federal government in the tools that they're building, as well as with groups like SolarWind that are out there, and understand what's going into your life cycle, into the development piece of that, right? But then you go take that to the next level and talk about zero trust, the things that are important right there. So Heidi mentioned, understanding user behavior. So UABA stuff and the AI world around there has been key in building out SASE infrastructures. Like I'm sure Sean can mention those as well. And understanding what's happening at different times. Is this something that's supposed to happen? And then is this the right person? It's not the simple idea on the credit card fraud type thing where it's like, oh, this person just bought something in New York City and now they're logging on again from China. It goes beyond that. But then you start to build in the other pieces of zero trust architecture, like multi-factor authentication, where possible, and least privilege. In a lot of cases, you've got these service accounts from the past where they were built in with this super high privilege, and that's how the SolarWind hack worked. Is they found an account that had elevated privileges that wasn't being monitored, and going through that. So you go through that whole phase of, okay, I've got my user behavior, I've got what the least privilege of that is, and then all of that stuff comes through from a networking perspective and from a data perspective using API calls and the tools that are available within these different areas, and then logging that back to a SIEM type infrastructure as well, and monitoring those logs constantly. And the problem is, not to go too far down the road and take away from all the other questions here, but using AI in that space is critical, because the amount of information that's coming in now from all the different edge devices, all the different devices that are out there, all the data that's out there, all the IoT information from a sensor perspective, pulling that in, it is impossible for a physical person to look at all that and comprehend it. You need the additional tool set that you have within the AI space in order to get that to the right eyes, so that you can, and so that you can get to the right point. That helps. I mean, Sean, do you have anything to add to that, or?
Yeah. No, let me go back. I think Kurt, you're spot on what you are mentioning. To go back a little bit on the SolarWind side. So from my standpoint, I need to be careful. It's an active investigation. We're very limited we can talk about. Encourage everyone to go to the CISA webpage on supply chains and find out the latest there. But we step back from SolarWinds itself and look at some of the more attacks in general that are going on. I mentioned before about a lot of the sensors and a lot of our visibility from a security perspective was built on that north-south traffic. And the north-south traffic used to be pretty easy. You knew what was the web. You understood what was going there. You understand remote users or public users coming into DMZs. But now, especially when you have remote users connecting maybe, from their home network, or you now have cloud providers, and how well do you trust that provider? Maybe they actually provide stronger controls in some ways, or apply security closer to data than you can on your on-prem data center. So really, we had this talk before about how the network compass is broken. It's no longer as simple as north-south or east or west. It's really a blend now. And so if you look at SolarWinds, just some of the adversary tactics in general, they really move toward less about that north-south and that trust that's implicitly built between the east-west traffic. And they're trying to take advantage of that. So we talk about supply chain, like Kurt was talking about, how the adversaries taking advantage of the trust we've built into our system and third-party systems. And so it's really, as we move towards zero trust, gaining that visibility toward that east-west traffic is key, I think, to be able to secure ourselves in the future.
Yeah, and I see we're getting a number of questions, and please keep them coming in. I'm going to get to them in a minute, but I have one question for you, Sean, as a follow-up to that, which is always perplexing to me. Early on, you said how complex this was. One thing that I always find complicated to wrap my brain around it, and I want to hear how TIC 3.0 helps to achieve this, is the scalability of this policy making. Like if you look at it, certainly within DHS or DoD, like there's classifications of individuals with have certain access to maybe one piece of data or one pipeline coming in or access to another. If you're an agency and you have lots of different classifications of data and individuals that have access to that data, where do you start there? How do you put in those policies and then scale that across an enterprise as big as DHS or DoD?
Sure. No, that's a great point. You have a lot of those federated agencies, right? DHS, you mentioned, with the components, HHS with the optives, and some other ones like that. And how do you, at that level, gain that visibility across the entire enterprise, across the entire agency? So those questions you're asking, James, are the exact same questions internally that we've had with a number of the interagency working groups. The federal CISO Council has a Zero Trust Action Committee working group going on. And there's representation from both the DoD side, from NIST, Sylvia Burns leads it from FDIC, but there's a number of agencies in there. And those are the questions exactly we have. And going back to I started out, the conversation was they're really looking at these proof of concept or these pilots to apply those lessons learned and then scale out from there. So part of the challenge is with zero trust, you really want to have some of the more modern cybersecurity tools in place, or protections in place. So you need to be able to put the zero trust architecture around that data, where that data is already embedded into some of that type of solutions, like cloud architectures. I think to your point, there's a concern. Okay, what do we do for all the legacy components? And for some agencies, it may be bolting a security solution in front of that. Ideally, that's not a true pure zero trust, right? You want to move that access closer to data. So it's going to be a long term for this. I think we're just in the beginning stages of learning how to do that across .gov.
And so, and again, I'll get to the audience questions here shortly. I promise. Keep them coming in. Is Sean, can you talk a little bit about those pilots in terms of, like, can you talk about an agency that has had some initial success in building that out? And then I certainly want to hear from Heidi and Kurt into, this is so complex. Like, what are some practical things that agencies can do to start to move in this journey? And it really is. It's like IT modernization. It never stops. It's constantly evolving with technology. But Sean, are you able to talk about how any of those pilots are coming?
Sure. Let me just explain the pilot. So we work in a number of pilot agencies. They suggest pilots that will sponsor or support some type of architecture solution we're interested in documenting the use case. So ideally, we'll have a couple pilots that will feed into these use cases we build out, and those use cases are adopted by agencies, the greater use of the agencies for their interpretation. One thing we're very cognizant of is we only talk about the agency pilots if the agency's talking about them. So the one that I think is most relevant out there right now we talk to is the State Department. And you listen to Jerry Karen from State Department talk how they are, Jerry, to their credit, they're really leading some of those zero trust architectures. And James, you hit it, where some of the zero trust discussions at agencies are really just the IT modernization efforts, and they're now putting some zero trust around the IT modernization. But I think the one that'd be the best example for a lot of the different agencies to look at would be start with Jared Caron's team. To be fair, Jared, I think he's on a detail, but it's the State Department solution for zero trust.
Awesome. Thanks, Sean. Kurt, we'll go to you, and then Heidi. What are some practical things that agencies can do to start that adoption? We've been talking about zero trust isn't a single tool or a box that you can just buy, especially when you think about in terms of data security. What are some practical steps that people can take?
Sure. I mean, I think when we start to talk about the specifics around data, I'm just going to mention the data stuff quickly. I think it's been mentioned a couple of times already. Is like, identify the location of all your organizational data. Data visibility more than anything is going to be key. Understanding where stuff is, understanding the classification of that information, right? Once you have that and understand those things, then you can start to do things like, securely remove data that you don't need anymore, whether that means going to completely offline with it or something like that, or just deleting it, because many times it's duplicative and you need to deal with that. Understand your roles, understanding least privilege, those kind of things, and take the idea of zero trust architecture and then map it into what your organizational, wherever you can, maybe your organizational IT mission is, map it to those goals so it becomes real. Just saying I want to be zero trust architecture and then not mapping it to what your organizational goals are, it winds up becoming, I don't want to use it this way, but it winds up becoming like, oh, that's just kind of like what the IT guys want to do or something like that. It's not, hey, this is going to give us this. Understanding that bit of information right there. And, on top of that, when you talk about classification of data, you've got the idea, once you understand where your data is, you've got to understand all of the, I don't want to use compliance as a dirty word here, but there are requirements that you have to have, whether it's, if it's something where you've got PCI information, or you've got, you're dealing with European folks and dealing with GDPR, or, the multiple, healthcare groups that are within the federal government, and they've got to deal with HIPAA environment. So they've got to understand that information, understand that data, understand how to protect that information, and then kind of move forward there. So mapping it in there, I think, is going to be really key there. I don't know if Heidi wants to add something to that at all, but
Heidi, any additional thoughts? Like, how is Forrester? What are some of the, I guess, quote unquote, best practices that Forrester is helping to support and consult agencies, or even, private industry?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like Kurt and Sean have hit on some key ones already. It's that kind of mapping to make it relevant. But it's also, if you think of it as like an approach, then yes, there's a whole amount of things you could do here if you're thinking about modernizing your IT systems, putting that zero trust lens on those decisions that you're making there. And for every organization, I think what is practical is going to be slightly different. So what we recommend is that you take a look at your security maturity as it relates to zero trust today, sort of like your baseline assessment of where you are today, because that's going to be different for everyone. And understanding where you are today, you can now start to put in place things that you would want on that roadmap to get to that next stage of maturity or that next phase. So you can figure out what to prioritize, because if you feel like you already have a good handle on discovering, classifying your data, then that's not where you focus your energy at this point in time. This type of assessment just helps you to break it down into more bite-sized pieces so you don't get overwhelmed. And I think another piece of this is also to think about, tying it into people. It's a hidden benefit that I think a lot of folks don't really talk through or think about is how zero trust improves the overall employee experience as well, because that's going to be a critical thing for getting buy-in and having support across the organization. So if we're looking at this in terms of employee experience, it's, you want Zero Trust to enable people to access resources securely, regardless of where they are, where they're coming in from. So then you can start to tie that into maybe some of the controls you implement in support of Zero Trust, whether that's encryption, enforcing least privilege, verifying device health, and so on, or thinking about how you might do things like remove VPNs and use Zero Trust network access to enable that type of thing to happen.
I think one thing that's also kind of important there is understanding. We talk about understanding your information and stuff, understanding your data, but understanding your people. And a lot of folks, in the past I've seen using, like a profile or a persona to understand, hey, this is one of my types of workers, and this is like I was formerly the chief enterprise architect at the FBI years ago, and understanding what a special agent needs in a specific situation versus what an analyst might need in a certain situation, and understanding those patterns of behavior and patterns of data usage are quite important in order to move things forward. Another couple of areas that I think are important to understand are around encryption. So where you can implement data at rest encryption, using FIPS 140, 140 compliant drives, using data in flight in between things as well. So
yeah, just to piggyback on Kurt there and what Heidi was saying a little bit before, there's almost a little bit of a cognitive dissonance with Zero Trust in terms of we want to make sure that the user has the access they had before. And this is some of the reasons we go through these pilots, is because we apply these different controls, but we still want to make it easy for the user to be able to access that data. At the same time, we know we want to add more friction for the adversary to move around the lateral environment. So it's that balance, the ease for the user to get to the data, but that friction, repeating back to our favorite 19th century Prussian general there, von Clausewitz there, chapter 7 of book 1, that friction, right? Adding that friction to adversary, making it more difficult for the adversary to gain visibility in the network.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot there that to unpack. One of the questions that we got from the audience, and I'll just tee it up for whoever wants to jump on it, is when the network has been compromised by a cyber threat, are there methods for tracking the threat's progress or navigation path within the network? I think that certainly is something that had with recent hacks. So are there methods for determining intent? I guess those are kind of two questions. I guess I'd start with the first one is, are there methods and ways to track progress and navigation, the navigation path in the network once it's been compromised?
I think if you look at the efforts that MITRE with the attack framework have come out, and then you start to look at how the vendors have started to map their solutions, say, okay, we cover like a heat map, we cover this part of that life cycle of the attack itself. I think that's a good place to start for that question. I think one of the things, and again, I'm being very cautious about SolarWinds, but if you look at the way that some of the more novel attacks are coming out, are going past those first stages of a typical attack, and they're not using maybe vulnerabilities the same way that were used in earlier attacks. So I'm interested to see how the vendors reply to how this attack has come out, and other ones, of course, to these new attacks. Sorry.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense right there as you're like, and I'm going to go back to one from many years ago when we talk about the issue on the target side. If you remember that one, where they were doing point of sale devices around, and then they also had another one where it was around air conditioning or whatever. And then those air conditioning ones, because they had these elevated accounts, were able to get into information and do other things that were, understanding the role of what those accounts should have been for is where you need to start to look. So, you don't need a super account that's going to have access to everything. You need to make sure that the accounts that you're using have the least privilege in order to move where they need to move. I think that's really important right there.
Well, so how important is intent? Certainly, I mean, I think that's, put the recent hack aside, but I mean, how important is it to, once something happens, and how is there technology, or is it just part of the investigative process to figure out what the intent was, then to stop future attacks, I would think?
Sure. I mean, that's part and parcel with everything that else is going on right there. When we talk about this, it is some of the idea of the investigative part of it, but then it's taking that investigative part of it, and it's being done by many different groups out there, taking that investigative part of it and then making that into a much more automated response. So the more information that comes in, the machine learning piece of this comes into play as well, saying, okay, this is something that is outside of the norm. Understanding the norm, understanding and better understanding norm and persona helps us educate either the OEM vendors or whatever else is out there from a policy perspective. This is not normal, and this is and those algorithms are in place already in many of the different products that are out there. I don't know if anybody wants to add anything else.
No, I just say motive is important, and understanding the motive is important. And what an adversary may be doing from a ransomware attack is greatly different than we're seeing with some of the more recent attacks. So motive is key. There's a large debate about attribution itself, but understanding the motive going back to what we talked about before with Heidi, understanding your data, then you can understand what would be the motive of the adversary to try to take advantage of that data. So it goes back to the inventory and awareness of what your inventory is.
Exportation of data outside of your environment to somewhere where it doesn't need to go is an obvious one.
Yeah, for sure. So I got another technical question, Kurt, if you want to jump on this one first. How do you see the use of software-defined interconnect, or SDI, technology being leveraged to support secure on-demand network connections and data exchange for zero trust nets? That's over, but I'm gonna line it up to you.
So there's so many different software-defined pieces right here, and understanding how these, how these different things. So we're talking about different, software-defined WAN, software-defined networks, and the interconnection between a lot of them. How we're delivering routing and kind of removing the control. Like there's a whole discussion around, and we're definitely not going to have time for all this, but a whole discussion around intent-based routing and how we can remove that and deal with algorithms in order to make sure that the connection is going to the place that it needs to go to, and understanding how those things move around. And then that all becomes part of the policy that you're implementing on top of that as an overlay, to make sure that not only are you able to get to the information that you need to get to, but people who are, I shouldn't say people, entities that are not, do not get to information that they don't need to get to from that perspective as well.
Sean, I got a question for you. First, a comment from an audience member that said they thought your background was really cool when they thought it was a virtual, and then when you pulled the book off the shelf, they thought it was even way cooler. So kudos there. Now to the question. It says CISA has planned an initiative to expand the shared service offering of Security Operations Center as a service to additional federal civilian executive branch customers. Is there currently a zero trust framework in place to assess customers as they are onboarded into a shared SOC offering?
So that's definitely one that we've had multiple discussions about. It's the shared service model. We've just started to stand up that office last year. I mentioned a little earlier, I think, about some of the efforts that CISA is doing towards zero trust, and in those discussions, having a shared service through, and also through our efforts to support with NCPS and CDM. Also, the larger programs as a whole, yes, we are looking at how, as agencies move to a zero trust environment, how can we help them, how we could accelerate that, then also how do we need to change to be able to receive visibility into that. So definitely something we're discussing.
Awesome. Another question around software-defined networks, and Kurt, maybe again swing it over to you, because I know we're zero trust is moving beyond the perimeter. But what are downsides to software-defined networks? One of our audience members would like to know.
I was just starting to type probably some answers to that as well. So, let's see, downsides of software-defined networking. And unfortunately, one of the biggest downsides is that it can certainly be confusing, and there has been a lot of talk about it and a lot of work done. The hard part, one of the hard, so when you talk about like ONF and stuff like that, you're talking about, there's been, my opinion is there's been too many different implementations of it. And moving across all of them, like there's been a couple of different areas that have tried to say, okay, well, I'm going to take this from this piece and this from this piece, and too much of it has been proprietary. More and more making the open side of it, not just compliant, but as a rule, I think has been one of the issues right there. I think I'll just leave it there for now, but I think it's a tough one.
No worries. We'll take this last question from the audience, and then I want to wrap up with everybody as we're getting close to time, and see if you have an answer. I do think it's an interesting one. Are there simulation and training, simulation and modeling tools available that you're aware of to model your network and then perform essentially gaming or scenarios by throwing different attack vectors at the network to see what an attack might look like, to then adjust your architecture, your zero trust model or approach to that? Anybody aware of anything?
I could answer a little, but I need to be sensitive because some of this is vendor. But I know up at the NIST NCCOE with the lab, they are starting to stand up a way to be able to model some of those attacks and model different architectures and see about the applicability of serving that. To be fair, I know there's some quasi-govy private entities that are doing some labs for zero trust, and agencies can look at those to be able to model out their architectures. And then I'm also familiar, just from reading the press, the DoD is very familiar from their standpoint, again, a better positioning in terms of lab and being able to model some of that out. So there are some activities going on both in the government side and like a quasi, government industry side as well.
Yeah, it goes back to the same sort of red team, blue team stuff that's been going on for a while there. I think it's an interesting concept that someone would do this specifically on a zero trust architecture framework would be an interesting way to approach this. I think is I don't know of anybody specifically that's going across the board and trying to do that way. There's certainly the ability to, from a software development side, the ability to inject different types of, look and feel to how things could be open and pulling in information and preventing that from happening in the first place. But I don't know of anything that's specifically going across the entire, infrastructure and hit it that way.
I think Kurt brought up a good point. One thing we do in our TIC pilots is when the agencies build out their environments, we work with our threat hunting team for threat emulation. So they emulate what a threat actor would do. And the reason is when we're doing these pilots, a lot of the pilots, the users are, good citizens of the doing good operational security. So we may not see a signal in all that noise. So that's why we do this threat emulation. And then be able to see, okay, what is generated out of this type of solution? What is that new signal we want to gain? So it's a fair point to recognize we need to gain that type of awareness of what the new signal is.
Yeah, I think that, I think everything that we've talked about today, certainly visibility and establishing baselines are critical to any zero trust, model or architecture. So you can kind of need to know where to start. And then I think, Sean, a lot of the work that you guys are doing over at CISA in terms of identifying those specific use cases that agencies where they can start, to your point, Kirk, is the zero trust architecture or approach to a very specific government mission and then kind of building out to there. But I want to wrap it up since we're about at our time. Heidi, I'm going to start with you, but same question to Sean and Kurt. What is one, if we could leave our audience with, a 60-second wrap up here, what is the one piece of advice that you would give to a agency as they're exploring, how to move to a zero trust model, whether they have to transition fully from a perimeter security or are just starting from scratch?
Ooh, yeah. I mean, I'd say set realistic expectations for yourself. It's not a rip and replace strategy. It's not a 90-day sprint to get to some type of end finish line here. This is something that needs to be woven into your approach to cybersecurity. It's a way of thinking about how you develop your architecture, what controls you put in place, the technologies you adopt. So just look at it through that zero trust lens. And it's a process that you'll be on over time. I mean, we've seen within enterprise, a realistic timeline for this type of transformation can be 3 to 5 years, depending on complexity of the organization, the environment, maybe even longer. So it's great to hear Sean mention all these great resources and working groups that have been put together.
So Sean, maybe that's your advice is how can they continue to engage with CISA to help them on this journey?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Heidi, for the shout there. Maybe purely selfish for a moment. So the TIC program office, we released a remote user use case in a draft form. It's a remote user. This is outlined from the OME memo. It's a remote user going to cloud sanctioned providers, going to their on-prem data centers, and also remote users going to the web. This builds off the interim telework guidance released in April. That interim telework guidance was about 20-25 pages of guidance. This draft use case we just released is about 50 pages of guidance, almost double the guidance. We have a request for comments period open for this month, ending pretty soon there. We welcome comments toward that. Exactly what we've been talking about, James, towards zero trust. We've positioned some zero trust themes in that remote user use case, but we recognize that remote user use case may not perfectly nail what we've talked about with some of the zero trust. So ideally, we want to build out a separate zero trust use case later on. But we think this leads agencies down that path of going toward our zero trust model. So again, thank you to everyone for their time and opportunity. You can find that use case on the CISA's website, cisa.gov/trusted internet connections.
Awesome. Thank you, Sean. Kurt, bring it full circle. Wrap us up.
Sure. Well, since I know we're already over time here, but real quickly, I'm just going to reiterate the one thing is understand the information that you have. And really once you understand that, making zero trust part of your other IT projects to understand dependencies and where those efficiencies can take place. And, wherever, Thundercat and our partner NetApp in terms of their F policy and understanding zero trust in terms of that information can help. Certainly willing to have the conversation.
Awesome. Well, I really appreciate it. I think that is very practical advice. Unfortunately, we are already over. So I want to thank all of you in our audience for joining, staying with us for this insightful conversation. Really want to thank Thundercat and NetApp featuring Forrester for hosting today's webcast and bringing us together. This will be available on demand, so I please encourage you to share this with your colleagues, and have a great rest of your afternoon.